Imata tātou ni. Kei te pēia tō ipurangi, te amoro?
Ahua pai, taku mōro.
Mau pia tō tātou karakia me tō tātou mei, a te pōnei.
O tēnā tātou, ngauri o Ngāti Mutunga, kua hono nei ki runga i tēnei ipurangi. E mihi ana ki te kaupapa, horahia nei. Me te mihi anō rā ki te matatini, katahi anō kahi pātsu. No reira, ko tō tātou karakia mo te rangi nei, ana whiria te kaha i runga, whiria te kaha i raro, whiria te kaha uta, whiria te kaha tai, whiria kia u, whiria kia mau. Whiria tātou ki tēnei muka kaupapa aipurangi nei, ko te Māori kei runga, ko te Māori erangi, Māori pū kei wa o kei te whai au, kei te ao mārama, e rongo whakairea ki runga ai, turo whiti waka mau a kia tīna.
Tīna.
Tai ki.
Tai ki. Ka pai tēnā koe te amoroa. Tēnā tātou e te whānau, ka pai te ki te ia koutou, i tēnei pō, me te mihi hoki ki tērā kaupapa te matatini, me te whānau i tū mō ngā purapura o te taihau auru, ngā rōpu katoa te motu. Hueno e mihi ana ki a rātou, mihi ana hoki ki o tātou mate, me te hunga anō kua pākia kinotia nei, e te awa me te marangai, i te tairāwiti, i te mataua Māui, no reire mihi ana ki a rātou katoa. No reira tēnā rā tātou, hoki mai rā ki a tātou te hunga ora. So kia ora everyone, so it's great that you've joined us tonight, just acknowledging te amoro and our whānau of ngā purapura o te taihau auru who stood at te matatini. So it's wonderful to see our rōpu there and just great to see you all this evening. So we've got about an hour. And what we'll do, whānau, I've got some slides. So really the purpose of this evening is to give you an insight in terms of where we are to date on the Maunga settlement. And so I'll go through this. There's quite a few slides and there's a bit of detail. But if you have any pātai during my kōrero, feel free to pop it in the chat and then we can reference that. But if we get to the end of the presentation, we can just have an open kōrero. So if you've got any questions or any other matters that you want clarification on, we can do it there. Ka pai? We all see that? Yeah, so as I said, so what I'm going to do is just provide some background. So some of you may not be aware of how we got to the place we are at the moment in terms of negotiating redress in relation to the Maunga. We'll then talk about the framework that was developed, which is in 2016 now. So it's been a few years since we commenced engagement with the Crown. And then I'll talk about the two main components of the framework, which is te mana o ngā maunga, te mana o te kāhui, and then we'll talk about the next steps, and then we'll have any pātai or other kōrero that anyone might have. And so it's really important in terms of background. We've used this particular whakawai, or this particular kōrero here, which really speaks about the fact that a group of iwi that are united will not be overcome. So that's that statement, e kore hoke e tae he mate no te iwi kotahi. So it reminds us of the importance of unity and working together and collaborating. And the second part of that kōrero references the pathway that our ancestors took when they left Hawaii. But it's really just to anchor our 8 iwi to be really committed to working collectively. And as we always discussed, and this has been discussed by multiple generations, if anything's to bring or anything or anyone is to bring us together as the 8 iwi of Taranaki, it would be our tūpuna maunga. And so when we think about Ngāti Mutunga, this is a piece of the section 13 of the settlement deed of Ngāti Mutunga, which was signed way back in 2006. So a number of years ago, but basically at that time and other deeds of settlement of the the other iwi of Taranaki reflect similar language, which one references the importance of the maunga, and then basically two talks about the fact that an apology and cultural redress will be negotiated in relation to the maunga. And so you'll see there what it basically states is that once all of the iwi had concluded their comprehensive settlements, then we would collectively negotiate redress, cultural redress in relation to the maunga. Now, the key thing is that the Crown look at, you have commercial redress, which is financial, and then you have cultural redress. So the understanding was always that any negotiations regarding our maunga would fall within the category of cultural redress. And so how did we get going? So at the time, we've basically come together. What you have here is the 8 iwi entities of the Taranaki iwi, and then we basically agreed a memorandum of understanding and appointed a negotiating team. So I was appointed as the lead negotiator, and the remaining negotiators, because we had Tihi Noble, who was one of our 5 negotiation team members, passed away a couple of years ago. So we have Hemi, Sungren, Liana Potu, and Te Pahunga Davis from down south. So that's sort of our negotiating team, and we're basically doing the negotiations and also a lot of the operational work. When we entered into working together as the ADU with Taranaki and then also with the Crown, we set out these sort of core principles which have guided the way in which we've interacted with each other, but also how we've interacted with the Crown. It's just always important to reference those. One of the big challenges, of course, when we come together collectively is a desire of iwi to be able to retain and maintain their mana motuhake, their own authority. And we think through the process we've managed to be able to do that, whilst also thinking about some of these other principles of being intergenerationally focused, working collectively, this whole concept of manaakitanga, which is actually reciprocal about how we care for others, so that they might care for us. And then also thinking about the importance of, acting appropriately and transparently. So when we embarked on the process of negotiations with the Crown back in 2016, the Crown basically said, okay, if we're to negotiate with you, these are the 5 parameters which will guide our negotiations and discussions. And when you start to sort of look at these 5, and when we looked at it, we weren't very happy, because you could view these as being very limiting and constraining. So one, here we are, we're entering negotiations, and the Crown is saying that the maunga will be retained as a national park. The second piece is that existing protections, whether they be conservation or recreation values, will also be maintained within that area. There was a bit of a glimmer of hope in the 3rd bullet point there, where ultimately whatever is negotiated needs to be fit for purpose and durable. But also, again, there's this sort of constraint, because they talk about setting precedents and the fact that there are other national parks in the South Island. And the 4th bullet point was really our only opportunity, which was for us to be able to develop a set of aspirations, and then how the Crown might respond by actually giving life and expression to those aspirations through the arrangements that we're looking to negotiate. And at the time, I don't know if many of you have heard of the Tuuta settlement, so that had a lot of coverage. Tuuta was previously a national park, and was removed from the National Parks Act and has its own piece of legislation. And so the Crown said, yep, we might have done Tuuta Taranaki, but we're not going to replicate that in relation to your maunga redress. So that was quite confronting, because as you can see, again, the Crown trying to dictate terms. But what you'll see through the presentation, the way in which we've been able to achieve the aspirations that we set. So in terms of the settlement process, these are basically the steps. So it starts with, you've got to have mandate recognised. So for us, because each of the 8 iwi had settlements, it has been the post-settlement governance entities. So for us at Ngāti Mutunga, Rūnanga o Ngāti Mutunga mandated to advance negotiations on our collective behalf. The next step is basically setting a terms of negotiation with the Crown, he mātāpono takapau kōrero, and really what that entails is setting out a framework by which we will engage, and again what those parameters might be. The third sort of box there is he kawa tupua, which was the aspirations framework that we developed to guide us in our negotiations with the Crown, but importantly, becoming a reference point. So being able to reference what we've achieved with the Crown against the set of aspirations and our framework. He anga pūtake rongo, which was basically a pathway to settlement, which was a record of understanding with the Crown, was recorded 2 elections ago. So that was the back end of the national government. We'd done a whole lot of work, and in light of the fact that settlements like this are often treated as political footballs, we decided to record the agreements that had been made to date and the work that we were going to continue to do. So that was the last part of the previous national government. And then since that time until now, we've been developing the collective redress deed. And essentially what we're going to do today is look at the core components of that redress deed and how we've framed that and what it means for us as individually, but also collectively for Taranaki, but more importantly, what it means for our tūpuna maunga. So when we're talking about our maunga negotiations, we're basically talking about the land which comprises the current Egmont National Park, which is the dark green area. And you'll see there are pieces off to the side, but by and large, it's that area, which is circa 36,000 hectares. And when you look at our maunga, although we see Taranaki, we also recognise that there are a number of maunga that sit within the current national park, such as Pauakai, Kaitake, Tēringa Niu, Pātuha, and others. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So that's what we're negotiating. So our framework, and the key thing here is, like, from our experience with settlements, it's been really important, and it is important for us to be able to set a framework, as I said, a framework that helps to guide not only our intention, but also our aspiration in terms of what we want to achieve through the settlement negotiations. And so we developed he kawa tupua. And so when we talk about this concept of kawa, kawa refers to principles of natural law. And when we say principles of natural law, it's the LORE, not the LAW. And when we think about natural law, it actually speaks about all of those elements that connect us to place to us, ko te taiao. And tupua, when we talk about the concept of tupua, we're elevating this to a sort of a really important sort of place. And so you'll see that throughout the document, and one of our key objectives for negotiations has been to bring to life and manifest our worldview and our understanding of not only he kawa tupua, the natural world, but also to use our language, our concepts, our symbolism, those things that make us who we are. And so, although we're negotiating redress in relation to our maunga, we've also seen this as an opportunity to reflect who we are as Taranaki by using our language, our reo, and our ways of being, so some of this traditional knowledge. And so this statement, ko tupua kawa, ko tawhito kawa, is something that is seen in a number of our karakia, and at its core, it really speaks to those ancestral connections that we have, those practices that make us who we are and connect us to the physical landscape, which, again, is part of who we are, right? So the concept of a pepeha, as soon as we stand, if we say ko Taranaki te maunga, ko ure nui te awa, it immediately locates us on the landscape. And so again, that concept of a pepeha, although we might find it sort of boring from time to time. Its purpose is also to remind us of our connection to place. So in terms of the framework, it's got two components. The key thing here is that when you think about the hierarchy of where we sit in the pecking order as human beings, as tangata, of course we are the teina from a hierarchy sort of tuakana teina sort of standpoint. And so at the core and the forefront of our thinking from the outset has been to recognize and promote the mana, the status of Ngā Maunga. You'll see there that we're talking about Ngā Maunga because it recognizes the fact that, you know, Taranaki is just one of a number of maunga, a number of peaks within the existing national park. And so that's been the starting point, ko te mana o ngā maunga. So recognizing and putting the maunga first. And then behind that, we've got ko te mana o te kāui. And so when we talk about the kāui, we're talking about the collective of 8 iwi, but we're also talking about the individual iwi and those hapu that may have a direct connection to Taranaki Maunga. And when we, in terms of the deed, what we have is at the beginning of each section is he karakiatanga kōrero or a whakawai. And this is sort of one of the karakiatanga kōrero, which is an ancient kōrero which refers to our understanding of how Taranaki came to be. And this is our collective Taranaki understanding. So it commences with our narrative around Maui. And we in Taranaki say Maui Mua was responsible for pulling up the big fish. And it goes through how the mountains were formed. And then it talks about the whakapapa of Rua Taranaki and Rauhoto Te Pairu, and how these maunga were established and set in place here in Taranaki. And again, so, you know, we've recorded this in the deed because this becomes part of that narrative and can be utilized in the future in terms of building greater understanding of, you know, who we are and our connection to our maunga. One of the other key components is that we've started with our whakapapa to the mountains, and then we've got three what we call te iho tā ngaingai. So that sort of umbilical cord, which has been unbroken, which establishes but also reflects the relationship between the maunga and ourselves as iwi of Taranaki. And we've captured this in three key po kōrero, basically. The first is the po whakaruru. And when you look at the po whakaruru, we started by describing this element in te reo Māori, and so that's it there. And then we've translated it into English. And really, te po whakaruru speaks of that connection between the sort of physical and social elements of our lived experience. And when we say our lived experience, from our tupuna through to the present day, and it talks about the role that Taranaki has played in terms of shaping who we are and what we do, whether that be the physical sort of landscape, you know, the rainfall, the cloud formations, right through to the fact that, you know, our whole understanding and perception of time and understanding those ways of being have been shaped by our tupuna, Taranaki. And, you know, a perfect example of that, of course, is the carved representations in terms of the maunga being shown in those carved forms. The second sort of po is he po taiora. And so po taiora talks about the physical dimensions, the fact that, you know, the maunga has shaped the physical landscape within our region. And, you know, the benefit of having a maunga like Taranaki is the fact that he's able, you know, he attracts sort of rainfall and water. So we're reasonably well endowed in Taranaki in terms of the water resource, but also the fact that there is unique biodiversity on the maunga as well. So that's the second piece. And then the final piece talks about he po kura, he po wānanga. he pou kōrero, which is really sort of reflecting those social elements of Taranaki, you know, reflecting the fact that, you know, they're not Maunga, they're not only Maunga, but they've shaped our identity, our language, our culture, and all of those sorts of things. So these three pou set the context. So we've got our whakapapa, and then we have the sort of te iho tā ngaingai, this kōrero, which basically provides the setting in terms of establishing the relationship between our Maunga and ourselves as iwi of Taranaki. And so when we look at the deed itself, the deed is broken into various parts. A core part within the deed is actually a piece which we've called Te Puiatanga ki te ao. And so this section starts with this kōrero here. So each of the sections within the deed, again, you know, part of this process is going through a bit of a process of decolonization, so of reclaiming space that, you know, our language, our understanding is valid, and, you know, can be utilized and reflected in legal documents like what we're doing. And so this statement here is something, it talks about transitioning from darkness to light. And so the components within this particular part of the historical, of the deed, report the history, crown acknowledgements, and apology. And we just thought, probably just to give people a bit of a sense of what the sort of history of the Maunga sort of looks like. And I've only gone back to sort of 1865, which is really the key piece that relates to you know, the sort of impact of the land confiscation, so the New Zealand Settlements Act. So basically the Maunga was confiscated as part of the Raupatu legislation, the New Zealand Settlements Act. And then what you've basically had is a series of arrangements over the Maunga which have excluded iwi of Taranaki. And that goes from that 1865 period right through to sort of 1970s. And so much of all of the decisions relating to the Maunga excluded our people. And then you have, you know, things like how it ultimately became a national park from the time of it being an Egmont Forest Reserve through to having this sort of permanent reservation status. And there are things like possums were liberated on the Maunga for economic development to create a fur trade, because it was seen to be, you know, they could sort of generate revenue from it. And now, of course, throughout the country and even at home on the Maunga, we're spending millions of dollars to be able to eradicate our tupuna of possums. And then what you have is a series of events which the establishment of the National Parks Act, what that meant in terms of the governance of the Maunga, the establishment of a number of recreational groups and clubs. So in this regard, you know, that's again is very little interaction and involvement of iwi, and so on and so forth. Things really start to heat up in the 70s, where the Taranaki Māori Trust Board, on behalf of iwi of Taranaki, were advancing many of the issues on our collective behalf, one of which was the confiscation of the Maunga, and also the naming. And so in 1978, we had the Mount Egmont Vesting Act, which was passed. This is a really critical point in time because our elders at that time had sought to have the Maunga returned, but it wasn't, the political sort of appetite wasn't there. But what effectively happened is the Maunga was handed back, and the same day, iwi of Taranaki, and I say that the Trust Board had agreed that the Maunga would be gifted back as a symbol of love to all New Zealanders. So that particular event has been a real sour point for a number of generations. But that's the background. There's a long historical account in the deed, which is a number of pages, probably about 20, 30 pages, which basically details much of the history of the Maunga and the interaction of government and territorial authorities with iwi. So now we're going to look at the first sort of component of the framework of Te Kawatupua, ko te whānau ngā maunga. And again, at the beginning of this section of the deed, we reference te mana rua, rua tupua, rua tawhito, rua taranaki, and there are sort of narratives around these being the traditional names of Kaitake and Pauakai. In terms of this section of the deed, it's broken down into a number of components, which are all listed here. And what I'll do is I'll just go through each of them briefly, and it will give you a sense of what we've been able to achieve. So the first component is the Kawatupua status. So the key thing here is that from the outset, one, we didn't want the Crown to own our tupuna maunga anymore. And then given there's 8 iwi, we didn't also want to chop up our tupuna and say, well, Ngāti Hene's got that bit, Taranaki this. And then there were sort of issues where those iwi that didn't have direct, weren't contiguous to the maunga and had looking rights. What does that all sort of mean? And so we agreed that our key objective here was to ensure that the Crown didn't own the maunga, and to find an elegant way of having the maunga recognised. And so because we had examples of legal personality with the Wanganui River and also Te Uruwera, we thought it important that we use that same mechanism and apply that in the context of our maunga. And so that's what we've done. So the legal person, so what does that actually mean? That means at law, the maunga have rights and interests not too dissimilar to you and I as people. Now, in order to recognise that, we have a statement like this, that Te Kawatupua is a living and indivisible whole, comprising Taranaki and the other tupuna maunga, including Pauakai and Kaitake, from their peaks down to and including surrounding lands. And so that statement basically recognises Te Kawatupua as this living and indivisible whole. Pretty fancy language. And so it says that our maunga is alive, that you shouldn't be chopping it up, and that actually, in reality, the maunga extend beyond the boundaries of the national park. And getting that statement's been quite a tough, it's been a long road, because, you know, people saying, what does it actually mean? So we've established that Te Kawatupua, which is the name of the legal person, has been recognised, and then you've got to give status to Te Kawatupua. And so effectively in the deed and the legislation, it creates Te Kawatupua as a legal person, like you and I. And it actually says that Te Kawatupua, so those collective peaks, Taranaki, Pauakai, Kaitake, from their peaks down to the surrounding lands, have the rights, powers, duties, and responsibilities of a legal person. And then it also says that these will be exercised and performed on behalf of and in the name of Te Kawatupua. And so because our maunga, well, they do speak, but they're not going to sort of stand up in court and do other things, there is a group that basically has been established to be the voice and the face of Te Kawatupua. So we've established that we've got Te Kawatupua, collective mountains. They'll be legal. They'll have the legal personhood at law. Then what we have is we've sort of developed a set of what we've called ngā pou wakatupua. And ngā pou wakatupua are a set of values which will guide how Te Kawatupua is governed and managed. And we've drawn again upon one of our ancient sort of karakia. This particular karakia was performed when Taranaki sort of arrived. And the story of Taranaki arriving is sort of one of both people and eruption. But this Pauakirunga, Pauakiraro is quite an ancient karakia. And so we thought that appropriate because ngā pou whakatupua are basically establishing sort of the values and sort of will guide decision makers in relation to the maunga. And so again, you know, one of our objectives here is to so just to think differently about how we view, how we perceive, or how we might sort of assist our maunga going forward. And so these values here are basically statements which reflect our relationship to our maunga, and they are statements that where we've drawn upon our own sort of traditional foundational knowledge. So it's, you know, our own ways of being and knowing. And so you've got the first one here, ko te kawi tupua he rarangi maunga here anuku here arangi. So what does this do? It affirms the fact that we, as iwi, view our maunga as an indivisible whole, which incorporates both the physical and the metaphysical elements. So, you know, ko te taha kiko kiko, that stuff you can feel and touch, and ko te taha wairua, those unseen things, those feelings and all of that stuff. So, you know, that again, it's a bit of a statement which speaks to our worldview. The second one there, ko te kawi tupua koia koho mātou nei o ki okinga, ko mātou nei tō rātou o ki okitanga. This again affirms the fact that these peaks, these maunga, are us as we are them. So it establishes clearly the whakapapa relationship that we have to our tupuna maunga. And so you're thinking, well, what do these ngā pou whakatupua mean in practice? So what this means is that when people are developing things like management plans or appointing people to be the face and the voice, in order to give life to these values and be guided by these values, you've got to understand them. So there are two sort of objectives here. One, to reflect our ways of knowing and being, and two, to ensure that with these being embedded in the legislation, they will become sort of a key bedrock, if you like, around key decisions and frameworks for the mountain going forward. The next one, ko te kahui tupua, ko te pune e heke mai ai te tangata. So, you know, as we know, said earlier, when we get up, ko Taranaki te Maunga, our maunga are the source of our identity, tikanga reo, health and well-being. You know, mehe mea kei te ora te maunga, ka ora te iwi. If the mountain's well, the people will be well. The next one, ko tupua kawa, ko tawhi te kawa, he kawa ora. Again, this sort of talks about this concept of tupua kawa, natural law, LORE, that we talked about. So all of those elements of the taiao, reflecting, a lot of that physical aspects of the maunga, whether it's land, water, flora, fauna, and the natural resources that the maunga hold. The last one here, ko te kawi tupua he puna koropupu. We know this kōrero because our wharekai, te titohia, is basically named after this concept. So ko te titohia, he puna koropupu, he manawa whenua, hei mauake nei te tini mokopuna. So reflecting that well-known whakawai, whakataukitanga kōrero, that Taranaki is the wellspring that will never run dry. And so, as is stated there, it reminds us that we must have an intergenerational view, whether we're governing or managing or discussing matters relating to the maunga. And that's a key thing that we need to hold true to across everything we do. So those are ngā pou tupua. And then we've got, okay, so remember whānau, we've recognised the kahui tupua, this group of mountains. They've recognised that law as being legal persons, and then we've got a set of values which will guide decision makers and governors and people undertaking operational management. And then what does it mean to have, what's the effect and status of te kahui tupua e ngā pou whakatupua? Again, so this section of the deed starts with another whakawai, another kōrero. And what you'll see with these kōrero, beyond the sort of maunga settlement itself, this is basically a body of knowledge that can be used by our people, because, you know, this is our kōrero, and it'll just sort of add to the corpus of material that we have. So the effect of the kāhui tupua status and ngā pau tupua. So basically, as I've already sort of indicated, the kāhui tupua status and the ngā pau tupua will be the foundation for governance, management and administration of Te Papakura Taranaki and Te Kāhui Tupua. So Te Papakura Taranaki is the name, will be the name of the national park. It won't be called a national park anymore because we don't want national park associated with our tupuna, so we've called it Te Papakura Taranaki. Papa being area, kura treasured, Taranaki of course locating it at home. So what does that sort of mean? The park, National Parks Act applies, except where we've modified it through the deed and also the piece of legislation that's been drafted. And what you have within the National Parks Act is section 4.1, which talks about the purposes of the park. And when you get past the fact that, you know, this is a National Parks Act, what you'll find is that many of those purposes actually align with our worldview. And so we managed to get over that. And really, as it says there, so persons exercising powers and performing functions basically need to align to the status and the values. Te tōpuni kōkōrangi. So te tōpuni kōkōrangi, as we said before, our maunga as Te Kāhui Tupua will have legal status. And so we need a group to be the face and the voice of our maunga. And so we called this group tōpuni. Tōpuni is a small group. Kōkōrangi has become very fashionable now as a word. So kōkōrangi is a stargazer. And the reason why we drew on this particular name is we want the people that will be responsible for our maunga to be like astronomers, you know, looking beyond our current lived experience and reality. So really having, being very ambitious. And so te tōpuni kōkōrangi. And again, this section of the deed starts with this kōrero, which is, you know, often if you sit in your house at night and you start to dream and wonder about what the possibilities are, we want this group to have that sort of intent. And really the key purpose of the tōpuni kōkōrangi, it will be a statutory body. So what that means is the legislation that will give effect to the maunga will establish this group. They'll be the human face and voice, and they'll be a body of 8, 4 appointed by the government and 4 appointed by Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, by the 8 iwi of Taranaki. And the key thing here, whānau, is that what we've done is we've been very clear in setting out criteria relating to this membership. And by and large, they need to understand and know the maunga and also the iwi of Taranaki. So it's highly likely that the majority of these members will be iwi people, will be Māori. And that's been the case with Te Awa Tupua, so the Whanganui River. They have 2 members that are the face and the voice of the river, and the iwi appointed Tūrama Hāwira and the Crown appointed Tariana Tūria. You know, so, and the key thing about Te Tōpuni kōkōrangi, they're not a representative body. They're a body that's there to act in the interest of the maunga. And they will have a number of functions, which I won't bore you with, but yeah, basically they speak on behalf and act on behalf of the maunga. They uphold the status of Te Kāhui Tupua, the values, ngā pau whakatupua, and are basically there to look at the well-being and interest of the maunga, and they can form relationships. And the key thing here is that Te Tōpuni kōkōrangi, because it is the face and voice of the maunga, can have relationships with individual iwi and also individual hapu. So we've provided mechanisms where that can happen. And, you know, ultimately their role is to act in the interest of the maunga, and they have a key role in developing and recommending he kawa ora. And he kawa ora is basically will be the management plan which will guide decision makers for the Maunga moving forward into the future. And so there's a number of other functions that are recorded. One of the key elements, as I said earlier, was repealing the Mount Egmont Vesting Act. So this act is still in force. So this was the act that basically the Maunga was given back to us for a day, and we gifted it back to the people of New Zealand as a symbol of love. And so we've started this section with Taranaki Maunga Murua Katoatia. And it sort of, there's a short statement that reflects the trauma and the consequence of our Maunga being negotiated, being confiscated, and the trauma that this agreement had for a lot of our people. Another part of te mana o ngā maunga is he tapanga whenua. So what we have in the agreement is a number of name changes. Well, they're not really name changes, they're basically affirming and putting back the original names relating to a number of sites within the Maunga itself. And so what you have here is some of those names. So the key thing is Te Kāhui Tupua will be the name of the collective Maunga, which includes Kaitake, Pātuha, Pauakai, Panitahi, and of course Taranaki. At the moment, it's Mount Taranaki / Egmont. Our Maunga Taranaki has a dual name. As a consequence of negotiations, it will just be Taranaki Maunga, not Mount Taranaki. The formal name will be just Māori Taranaki Maunga. And it's the first time that this has ever happened in New Zealand, where we just said, well, actually Māori is an official language of this country, and it's time that we accept that we don't have to use dual names. And then we've got some of the other key sites that have been reaffirmed on the mountain. So Te Rere o Tahurangi, for example, is known today as Bells Falls. Te Rere means falls. Tahurangi, that's the name of the tupuna who ascended the mountain and lit the fire on the top of Taranaki as a symbol of occupation and permanence. The government wanted us to call it Te Rere o Tahurangi Falls, which we said is stupid because it's really Falls of Tahurangi Falls. Doesn't make sense. And so some of those names, and then as I said earlier, in terms of the national park area, which is that sort of dark green, we said that we didn't want our tupuna referred to as a national park, so it will become Te Papa Kura or Taranaki. And as I said earlier, Papa being the area, Kura, we have strong narratives in Taranaki around Kura, although Kura is more well known today as being a school. Kura is actually a treasure, something that's treasured, and of course Taranaki. So I think, when you step back and you think beyond, this is actually quite a big one for us, our negotiating team, because we're shifting the mindsets and really pushing the boundaries in terms of the use of our reo. And when we think about that, the fact that our names, our language has been sort of placed back on the whenua. So ko ngā tapanga ingoa tērā. One of the other key elements of the deed is vesting of land and minerals in Te Kāhui Tupua. And quite simply, whānau, what happens is, because we've got a legal person, all of the assets are then vested, including minerals. So when we're talking about minerals, we're talking about particular stone and all of those sorts of things. So there's a section in the deed which basically sets out the mechanics around how this happens, and there are basically particular classifications of land. So and I won't bore you all, but it's all quite technical on the land front around which was Crown-owned land and how it's treated within the new arrangements. And then the minerals, again, vested in Te Kāhui Tupua. And then there are a couple of exclusions of land from Te Papa Kura o Taranaki, which really relate to some of the roading issues, which are more of a technical nature. one of the key elements of the framework and the arrangements is that requirement to develop he kawa ora mo te papakura o Taranaki, which is the management plan. And so this section, again, we started with a bit of our traditional knowledge. But he kawa ora is basically the management plan. Te tōpuni kōkōrangi, which is the 8-member board, which is the face and the voice of the maunga, will be responsible for the oversight and preparation of the plan. And basically the actual drafting itself will be jointly done by Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, which is the iwi entity, collective iwi entity. The Director General is the Director General of the Department of Conservation. And what we've done in the deed, there's quite a clear, detailed process as to how this particular mahi will be undertaken. And, you know, it's a very inclusive approach to ensure that we have iwi and hapu and community and any other groups that feel or may want to have a say or their views considered. But the key thing here, which is quite interesting, is that ultimately we've got a joint decision-making role between the Minister of Conservation and Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, the iwi of Taranaki, which is a very much a treaty-based partnership. And this whole model actually is co-governance, so which is quite topical at the moment with Three Waters and stuff at home. So yeah, the management plan is really important. The maunga at the moment has a management plan that is out of date, and so this will be one of the key areas of focus post-settlement. Then there's a section which basically details other matters that Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi is responsible for. So one is the name Te Kāhui Tupua. So under the arrangements, if anyone wants to use Te Kāhui Tupua as a name or in publications, we'll need to get agreement from Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi. So, you know, like IP, so this is quite going to be interesting to see how this goes. Taonga Tūturu, so Taonga Tūturu, there are current protocols around Taonga Tūturu, so where taonga are found on the maunga. In terms of the arrangements here, Te Kāhui Tupua will be the interim holder of taonga. So how does that work? So if someone finds, say, an ads or a tuki, it's immediately vested in Te Kāhui Tupua. There's another process of ownership through the Māori Land Court. But our thinking is sort of to make that easy. Te Kāhui Tupua will hold those taonga in the interim. Te Kāhui Tupua, given it's a legal person, can also hold and manage assets. So part of, you know, so, you know, we might have a whanaunga that sort of wants to give a large donation to the maunga that can be held in the name of Te Kāhui Tupua, and then applied for the purposes of Te Kāhui Tupua. There's another piece, the conservation management strategy is a key component of the conservation sort of makeup. And so there, again, just making sure that there is provision for Te Kāhui Tupua, and then Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi can enter into a range of relationships on behalf of the maunga, other than what was stated earlier. He tahua kōrero, he tahua whānanga. Another part of the settlement sort of speaks about resourcing. So we've really pushed hard. The Crown at the moment have agreed that $35 million will be provided to support these three elements here, the health and well-being of Te Kāhui Tupua. What does that look like? So on an annual basis, it could be a contribution to some of the mahi that's undertaken on the maunga. It will support the relationship of Ngāi Iwi o Taranaki with Te Kāhui Tupua. So that could be through facilities or facilitating wānanga, that whole sort of reconnecting sort of piece. And then the third element is that it provides a pool of capital to support Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, which is the iwi entity, to basically discharge its statutory functions. Key thing here, though, is that DOC will have some implementation funding, and they'll retain certain liabilities in relation to the maunga, because we don't want the kāhui tupua that doesn't have complete control of everything that happens on the maunga to have be exposed to particular liabilities and risk. Ngā ritinga mo te papakura o Taranaki. So the management side of things, again, we start with our kōrero here in this section. Key thing is that the day-to-day management responsibility sits with the Department of Conservation, but what we have within the deed is provisions that can be triggered in the event that we would wish to take over day-to-day management. And so we've detailed the aspirations that Ngā iwi o Taranaki have in terms of undertaking operational management, and then have been quite clear. We have expectations of DOC supporting our iwi to be able to grow our own capacity and capability to be able to discharge our kaitiakitanga responsibilities, but also to look at projects or other opportunities in partnership with DOC on the maunga. The final point is that at the moment is concession. So a concession is basically a right that is granted to a third party to undertake activity within the maunga. Taranaki has a handful of concessions. The major concession is with Pōria. They've got a big transmission tower up there. And so all income from concession, so any money generated from the mountain is to be reinvested back on the mountain, on the maunga. So that's a real biggie for us, because at the moment, you know, the amount of money that DOC's actually investing on the maunga is less than what they're currently generating from concessions. So that's, again, will contribute to the ongoing health and well-being of the maunga. Yeah, and then we've sort of talked about this, the fact that DOC and the iwi will draft the management plan, and then there will be sort of an annual business planning process, which means that there'll be greater involvement of Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, but also Te Tōpuni Ngarahu in terms of setting the sort of objectives on an annual basis, but also holding DOC's feet to the fire. So making sure that DOC are accountable for the performance or undertaking particular activities. So that brings greater accountability into play, which isn't really there at the moment. Now, I'm just mindful of time. We'll keep pushing through. The next part is ko te mana o te kāhui. So this is all of the redress that relates to us as iwi of Taranaki. And it's really broken down into these 4 key components. There's a cultural redress component. There's the governance piece, which is Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. And then we have particular redress and rights. So the cultural redress piece, again, we start with our little whakawai kōrero, which is one of my favourite ones, actually, because it says, he pataua no te rangi kauti te hiri ki te whenua, he pawa auahi no te whenua kauti te hiri ki te rangi, tangata tōmua mōmuri ko papa tuanuku. So, you know, like a raindrop that falls from the heavens and smoke, you know, that waft of smoke that goes into the sky, it sort of talks about that physical and metaphysical relationship between sort of sky and earth, but also the past and the present. And it reminds us of our responsibility to future generations. And so just quite quickly, whānau, we've already gone over the collective statement, so they were the 3 po, and the tiho tāngaingai, which was that whakapapa from the time that Maui hauled up Te Karoa Maui through to what we have today. We've talked about the official geographic names. Within the deed, there's provisions for individual iwi to have cultural take. So there's a framework which provides, so in the event some of our weavers or healers are wanting to harvest from Te Kāhui Tupua, then that sets that out, as does the cultural materials plan. And then within the framework, there is the opportunity for iwi to access the existing facilities within Te Papakura o Taranaki for cultural purposes. Te pai manukura, basically the governance and the leadership sort of piece, which is basically Te Tōpuni Ngarahu Trust. So we talked about Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi being those sort of stargazers, being very bold, ambitious. Tōpuni again, a group, Ngarahu are the embers. So and mahi tamariki in the old days had a dirt floor and had they'd place embers in the middle of the house to warm the house. And so we used Te Tōpuni Ngarahu because we very much want this group to be on the ground, connected to the place and actually doing the mahi. And so what we have there is that each of our Rūnanga throughout Taranaki, the 8 iwi, will appoint one member, and then there is the standard sort of accountabilities and so on. But the core purpose of this entity is to hold assets, appoint members to Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, and undertake the statutory functions that it's required to do within the arrangements. And one of those key functions is to draft the management plan and agree with the minister the management plan. Relationship redress. So again, part of this, because this is a whole new framework and arrangements, the Te Tōpuni Ngarahu entity will have particular relationships. And so there'll be a relationship with the Minister of Conservation. This is all around ensuring that the settlement is durable. This partnership and co-governance arrangement that we have is working. And the other thing is what we've provided for is that there's Section 4 of the Conservation Act, which has been challenged by one of our iwi in Auckland, Raitai. And it's really interesting. So the key thing here is ensuring that the duties that the Crown through the Department of Conservation have are continued to be upheld. And because we've had this court case in Auckland, we're spending a bit more time detailing what all of this means in terms of the court's guidance around what Section 4 of the Conservation Act means. And in short, what the court is saying is that the Department of Conservation hasn't gone far enough to give effect to the intentions, what was intended by that clause. So there's that. Then there's a section on non-derogation and standing. I think the key thing here, whānau, is that there's some non-derogation sort of clauses, but the key thing here is that Te Kāhui Tupua, our maunga, will have standing as you and I might have, or other entities might have, on particular matters. So it can effectively, Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi on behalf of the maunga can submit on behalf of the mountain. So it will be treated as an iwi authority or a public authority for the purposes of the RMA, or a public body for the purposes of the Local Government Act. So that's really great because it says, we as iwi can submit, but also our maunga as well. So that we think that's a really good thing. And then there is basically an implementation section, ngā tūkanga whakatinana, which basically details what the implementation process would be, the conditions, the effect of the deed, and then the legislation. But effectively on one page, whānau, these are the core components of the settlement. And I always describe it as, what we've negotiated as a framework. And we've developed and detailed that framework through our lens, through our language, through our thinking, through our through the sort of ways that we know. But you've basically got, the top left here, Te Kāhui Tupua, so that's establishing the legal person. You've got Ngā Pou Whakatupua in the status statement, which is basically the values and that statement of indivisible and living whole from the peaks to the surrounding lands, which basically references who we're talking about and how people need to give effect or be guided by these values. Then you've got the new national park, which is Te Papakura o Taranaki, and there are two elements there. There's the management plan piece, he kawaora, and then there's the operational management, the on-the-ground stuff and what the opportunities are there. Then you've got Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, which is the face and the voice of the Maunga. And so we've talked about that in terms of what their role is. We've got Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, which is the collective post-agreement governance entity, the 8 iwi of Taranaki. Again, what their role is. And then we've touched on the fact that there will be an apology, name changes, 35 million in resourcing, and importantly, a repeal, they will repeal the Egmont Vesting Act. So where are we? So we're currently sort of finalising the collective redress deed, and we'll look to go into ratification. And I'll just sort of talk about the outstanding matters. So we're nearly there on everything. So there's one big issue around, we've been pushing that the Maunga should be able to own assets within Te Papakura o Taranaki. So what does that mean? We say that the Maunga should be able to own buildings, also own, say, the Egmont, North Egmont Visitor Centre, and those sorts of things. The Crown is saying no, because the mountain has a conflict. And I really struggle with that because they're viewing it through a very Western lens. So we're working through that particular issue at the moment, which is proving to be a bit of a challenge. Te pire whakatupu o te kāhui maunga, this is basically, you have a deed, which is Te Ruruku Pūtake Rongo, which is our deed, which I've just sort of gone through the component parts of that. And then we've got a piece of legislation that will give effect to the arrangement. So the bill is 90% drafted. Liana and I on a weekly basis go through line by line. Not the most exciting stuff, but it's really important to make sure it's all good. Te tahua putia, so we're just awaiting confirmation. So what we've said to the minister is that 35 million, and when you think about the passing of time and the purchasing power of that money, that, we'd probably need 60 million here, but we've said to him that he should basically transfer the 35 million to the collective entity tomorrow. So we're just working through a process where we can get early release. So what does early release mean? It means that we don't have to wait till the legislation is passed in Parliament before resources are handed over. So we can receive them early and start to undertake some of the implementation work that's required. And then the final bit there, Te Tai Tuara Aiwi. So we as a negotiating team will be recommending to the iwi chairs and the individual Rūnanga a recommendation that we should proceed to ratification. And so that's really what we've got here. So ideally, all going well, and this isn't that far away, we'll give that recommendation. What that means is we will initial the deed of the Te Ruruku Pūtake Rongo, and then we'll then take that out to be ratified by iwi. And so that's going to happen between the 15th of April and the 9th of May. So there's 14 face-to-face hui and a number of online hui. In advance of that, everyone will get basically a little booklet summarizing the arrangements. We're really keen to have a smaller amount of paperwork and do more online videos and little infographics as part of that process. But all going well, and I think it's firming up that we'll probably look to initial the deed, which basically says we've done all we can do. We now need to give this to the people to determine whether we accept it or not. So that'll be 3rd of April probably. Keep an eye out once we firm this up, because there'll be a number of hui throughout the country with a view to signing Te Ruruku Pūtake Rongo in June, and really wanting to introduce the bill before the election. I say that because basically what we've negotiated here is a co-governance arrangement of our tupuna maunga. Whānau, he pātai. Oh, so we've just got a pātai around the maunga having a conflict of interest in owning assets. So basically because within Department of Conservation, or under the Conservation Act, and within the maunga you have a concession arrangement. So as I said earlier, concession is the granting of a right for a period of time to undertake particular activities. Basically, the Crown have said that because Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi have involvement in that process as the face and the voice of the maunga, that the maunga can't own or hold assets in the park because Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi has a conflict of interest. And we've said, well, it doesn't have a conflict of interest because what we're trying to, it has an aligned and vested interest in ensuring the health and well-being of our maunga. And so part of the thing we've been pushing back on the Crown about is actually your whole view and perspective of how you see and view our maunga in this process is at odds with the world view and what we're trying to implement and achieve here. So, and we're refusing to, we're just pushing back really hard because I just think it's stupid, but it's typical of the Crown really. Yeah, but that's it in a nutshell. They just say because the maunga is involved in setting the rules, that it can't benefit from those rules. But what we've said is that if you go back to the first principles of what we're trying to do here is maunga first, everyone else second. And I continue to say to the minister that I don't give a damn about some concessionaire missing out on owning something or having a right to access things on the maunga when you sort of look at that hierarchy of the maunga first. So, but we're hoping to get that through, and we'll have a decision as I said in the slide in about 2 weeks. Pātai anō? You can speak now because there's only, yeah, we've got a, even if you have a kōrero mai.
Jamie, in regards to the recreation of the different people that access that, are they going to be limited?
So there's two phases. So because you know what we've got at the moment is a redundant management plan. So you've got existing sort of rights will remain until the first kawa plan is developed. And so basically once that happens, there'll be a transition if there are particular activities that are at odds with the new kawa plan. But there's not a huge amount. And DOC haven't really granted a number of new concessions at the moment. But yeah, as I say, so the existing concessions will remain. We'll have the development of the new kawa, and then there'll be a process to be able to assess whether existing concessions are consistent or not with the new kawa plan. There's another question here around the concession revenue. So the concession revenue, we initially wanted that revenue to come in and be held by Te Kāhui Tupua, but within the deed and the bill, there are requirements for the Crown to basically account for the funding separately. So to show basically what the revenue is, and then to match that in their business planning around how that revenue has been applied. And so that's going to take a bit of time, I think more so for DOC getting their heads around the new world, because at the moment, all concession revenue goes into the central pot in Wellington. And even if, say, we generated 800, 900,000 in concession revenue from the maunga, at the moment, I think the Crown is spending less than just over 250,000 of actual dollars on the mountain, or about 300. Yeah, but it'd be, you're right, in terms of it goes into the central coffers.
Kia ora, Jamie, it's Matt here.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, bro. So just on that, so does that mean that whatever the revenues come in, they're required to be appropriated back every year through the budget? Is that what you're saying to DOC?
Yeah, so basically appropriated back not only to DOC, but actually to the maunga. Yeah.
Okay.
Which, you know, and so, I mean, the big concessionaire on the mountain at the moment is Kordia. And what's happened with the Kordia concession is because they have a number of concessions with DOC across the country. And so they've got a single concession with DOC. And so we've got to be able to break down what the contribution is to the tower that they have on the Maunga. But the thing is that basically Kordia have the tower and they sublet a whole lot of space, whether it's Spark, 2 Degrees, Sky, and it's a pretty good money maker for them. And so we've sort of said to the Crown, would be happy to send an NDA, but they need to be able to disclose, you know, what the arrangements are. They're, of course, pulling the commercially sensitive card at the moment, but yeah. Any other pātai? No? Oh, mihi ana kia tātou te pōnei, so we didn't do too bad for time. We started about 5 minutes late, so kia moro kei kona tunu koe?
Kia konei.
Yeah, well, just before we close, so we've got another session on Wednesday, so yeah, just let the whānau know if they want to sort of find out a bit more about the arrangement. So yeah, get them to tune in at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, and we'll go from there. Hoi no, e mihi ana kia tātou I te pōnei. So tēnā koutou, ka tukuna ki a koe te amoro.
Tēnā tātou. E tēnei rā te mihi atu ki te kaupapa me ngā mahi, me ngā ringa, I mahi whakapau kaha ana mō tō tātou tūpuna maunga. Ara ko Taranaki, me hoki atu rā ki taua kōrero la, ko te tito ea ka meinga tia e puna wai koropupu. Ko tuki tia e te poake kore nei e mimiti, ka koropupu, ka koropupu, ka koropupu. Nā e koropupu tonu ana te maunga, ngā wai e heke I hoa mai rā I te maunga, rārunga I ngā mahi e mahi ana I tēnei rā, I enei rangi tonu. Nō reira, e tika ana kia mihi atu rā kia liana mā, koutou rā, rārunga I o koutou nā mahi. Me te hoki atu rā ki ki tērā koroheke o tātou, ara I tū atu rā ngā purapura o te tai hauauru, ki te whakawaha atu ngā kororo o tō tātou koroheke, korohuirangi. Nō reira me hoki ki taua kōrero ara ana unu ia ki te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te arataka tū. Kia wātea, aira, kua wātea, au, wai marire. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora koutou.